Putin has wanted to get hold of me ever since this whole conflict started. A young man who worked for me was killed, and he'd still be alive today if he hadn't worked for me. Originally, the idea was just to go after the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, but it turned out that so many other victims came forward to the politicians who I'd been talking to and said, "You found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. Can you sanction the people who killed my brother, my husband, my sister, my aunt?" That they realized after about a dozen of these approaches that this was much bigger than one case, and they expanded it to all human rights abusers in Russia. My critics, or the critics of the Magnitsky Act, say, look, Putin is a really evil guy doing all these evil things. The Magnitsky Act is in place, and he hasn't stopped doing evil things. Therefore, the Magnitsky Act isn't effective. And I say to myself, and I say to them, well, how do you know what he would do if there wasn't a Magnitsky Act in place?
Bill Browder has been described as Vladimir Putin's #1 enemy. In 2005, he was Russia's biggest investor, but a series of campaigns to persuade the companies he invested in to improve their corporate governance led to him being deported from the country by Putin himself. After his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was beaten to death in jail, he turned to campaigning, and he's been lobbying to introduce laws placing sanctions on human rights abusers ever since. Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
My first question, I come from a business journalism background, and I don't know whether I'm interviewing a fund manager or a campaigner or a politician. Which of those are you? How do you describe yourself?
Well, I'm no longer a fund manager. After the murder of my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, I made a vow to go after the people who killed him and get justice. And so I've put aside my business life, and I guess I would call myself a full-time justice campaigner. But I don't really like these labels because the labels don't really mean anything. I still do business. I invest my own money from my own account, but I would say the driving force of my life right now is justice, and that's what I spend most of my time doing.
That's very superhero-y of you.
Well, I don't know about that. I'm more driven, I would say, by a feeling of guilt and responsibility that a young man who worked for me was killed, and he'd still be alive today if he hadn't worked for me. And so it's not out of any type of glory that I'm doing this. It's out of heartbreak and desperation and guilt that drives me every day to try to get justice.
This happened in 2009. Is it still anger and, kind of pure emotion that's motivating you? Is there something else that's motivating you now? How does that that guilt settle after a decade?
Well, it never settles. I mean, it's, I wouldn't, anger has probably subsided. It's not like I spend my day feeling angry but I just see this injustice carrying on. The people who are responsible continue to enjoy impunity in many ways, and as long as that's the case, I don't feel as if I can rest. And what I can say is that there's sort of like a poison circulating through my body of this watching this impunity, and the only thing that gives me any calm is knowing that I'm active and doing something to try to right this wrong, and that is the kind of thing that keeps me going and pushes me and makes me active 11 years after this terrible crime was committed.
In your book, you kind of describe rebelling against your communist family by deciding to become a capitalist. Do capitalism and campaigning, can the two reconcile?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's nothing wrong with capitalism. Capitalism is there's probably no perfect system, but capitalism is the least worst. It's not capitalism that's the problem. It's when capitalism is not properly regulated. It's when rule of law is not properly enforced. That's when you run into the problems. Allowing people to achieve their ultimate objectives, allowing people who are good at things to be rewarded for being good at things. That's what makes innovation. That's what makes the world a better place. It's not capitalism that's the problem. It's when it's, in Russia, for example, you have no laws, no institutions. And so you end up having capitalism run completely unchecked, and so it just turns into criminality, not capitalism. You have situations where the state needs to be involved, and that's by the state being involved. That's not communism. That's just proper regulation. And so it's just we're in a world where a lot of things go wrong, and people look at the underlying causes and say there's something wrong with capitalism. I don't believe that's the case.
How do your family feel about your kind of slight about turn?
When I first went into business and I became a hedge fund manager, my father, who is a left-wing professor, didn't feel good about it at all, and never really could kind of come to terms with what I was doing. And when I was a hedge fund manager and I was doing this in Russia, the way I went about doing it was by being an activist manager, and an activist meant in Russia fighting corruption. And it was interesting because the first moment that my father really started to like sort of acknowledge and I guess be impressed by what I was doing was when Harvard University did a case study on the Hermitage Fund, and he thought, well, if Harvard thought that was good, then maybe it is good what my son is doing.
So it's all about academic recognition,
right? In his case, that was the case, but and now I'm no longer I'm no longer a sort of hedge fund manager. I'm a human rights campaigner, and so it's hard for anyone in my family to criticize that.
You were quoted in Tatler saying, "I was not doing it altruistically. I was doing it to protect my investments. The altruism came later." What does that mean? When did the altruism come?
When I first started campaigning, it was as a fund manager, and it was because I was invested in big Russian companies where we were discovering just massive corporate corruption and stealing. When I saw that was just bad for my investments, and so I started to fight that. And fighting that was not just helpful to me; it was helpful to all the other investors in these companies. And because the state was the majority shareholder in these companies, the state was also benefiting. And so, even though I was motivated by seeing how the stealing was affecting the share of the share price of companies that I owned, and that was based on sort of personal self-interest, it had a wider benefit. But what I do now, which is fighting for human rights and fighting for justice, there's no financial interest in that whatsoever. This is purely for the good of the world, to satisfy myself that terrible things are not happening, and the benefit turns out to be much greater than for what started as a relatively narrow campaign. My original campaign was to go after the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and make sure they face justice. But in doing so, I came up with this concept, a legal concept called the Magnitsky Act, which would impose visa bans and asset freezes on human rights violators. And originally, the idea was just to go after the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, but it turned out that so many other victims came forward to the politicians who I'd been talking to and said, "You found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. Can you sanction the people who killed my brother, my husband, my sister, my aunt?" That they realized after about a dozen of these approaches that this was much bigger than one case, and they expanded it to all human rights abusers in Russia. And then when the Magnitsky Act passed in 2012, these senators who helped me do it, Senator McCain and Senator Cardin, thought, well, wait a second, why are we doing this just for Russia? We should be doing this for human rights abusers all over the world. And so they expanded the Magnitsky Act to become the global Magnitsky Act, to include bad people everywhere. And that's been passed. And so what started as a very narrow campaign for justice for one individual has turned into a worldwide movement of justice. And the Magnitsky Act has been used all over the world against Chinese officials involved in the concentration camps in Xinjiang. It's been used against generals in Myanmar who have been involved in the Rohingya genocide. It's been used in Nicaragua. It's been used in Venezuela. It's been used all sorts of places. There have been more than 500 people sanctioned by the U.S. with their Magnitsky Act, including, of course, the people who killed and tortured Sergei Magnitsky. And so it's really been a sort of a remarkable human rights success. I mean, if this had been if this had been a business venture, this would be a multi-billion-dollar enterprise in terms of the effect it's had and how many people it's touched and so on.
There have been accusations that during your time working in Russia and investing in Russia, you did things like employing disabled people specifically to make use of a scheme to ensure you pay lower taxes. There has also been accusations that you rejected your US citizenship and switched to UK citizenship for tax reasons. What do you make of those? How do you react to that kind of accusation?
Well, so let's go there each one. So the first one about the disabled people, they had a tax incentive in place that said if you employed disabled people, you could reduce your taxes. And so who wouldn't employ a disabled person to reduce their taxes? I think you would, and anyone else watching this video would. I mean, if you can reduce your taxes and employ a disabled person, that seems like a good thing. And that was a legitimate tax incentive that was available to all people, and those who used it employed disabled people. As far as my citizenship is concerned, I became a British citizen. I don't think there's anything. And why did I do that? I did that because I have a very my family background. My grandfather, who was the leader of the American Communist Party, was persecuted viciously by the American government. My grandmother, who was dying of cancer, they wanted to deport her back to Russia. And so when I had an opportunity to become British, I became British. I didn't become an Iranian citizen or a Venezuelan citizen. I became a British citizen. And I've been a happy British citizen I've been living in London now for 31 years. I'm a fully integrated part of British society. I don't think there's anything sort of sinister about being British. And so neither of those two criticisms in any way touch anything about me, and nor have they touched anything about the effectiveness of my human rights campaign.
You said just then that if this was a company, it'd be a multi-billion-dollar company. So what's next? What's in your 5-year plan, your 10-year plan?
Well, we're nowhere near done with the Magnitsky Act getting passed in different countries. So the Magnitsky Act, the value of the Magnitsky Act is it goes after sinister people who do terrible things, and even if they're never going to be prosecuted in their home country, it's a way of creating consequences. And it recognizes that the fact that many sinister things are done for financial reasons. And so if somebody does a terrible atrocity in, I don't know, somewhere in Central Africa, and their government doesn't do anything to them, if we can then sanction them in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in the EU, that's a consequence. But the consequence only works if all the places that they want to go to keep their money and travel to have these sanctions. And so, so far, the United States has passed the Magnitsky Act, the UK has, Canada has, and the EU has. And so, and then actually Kosovo and Montenegro also have. And so we're up to, I guess so we're up to 32 countries that have Magnitsky Acts, but there's still places in the world that don't have it. So Australia doesn't have a Magnitsky Act. New Zealand doesn't have a Magnitsky Act. Japan doesn't. And so my plan and my goal and my activities right now are to get all the countries that people would want to keep their money in, to get them to pass a Magnitsky Act.
Read somewhere that you were after tax havens to pass those acts.
Well, and we've succeeded, actually. It's very interesting because in addition to the 32 countries that have Magnitsky Acts, many of those countries are crown dependencies or British crown protectorates. And so, for example, Guernsey has a Magnitsky Act, Jersey has a Magnitsky Act, the Cayman Islands have a Magnitsky Act, and so the British Virgin Islands. And so those places have all been, Gibraltar, those places have been quite easy to get on board because they're sort of part of the British system. We also don't have Switzerland at this moment. We don't have Norway. So we're trying to sort of, I guess, do a cleanup operation to get every place that someone would want to keep their money and want to travel to with a Magnitsky Act. And that does take some effort. And so I've been working very closely with the Australian Parliament and with the New Zealand Parliament and the Japanese Parliament. And I think we're pretty close to Australia, a little bit further away with New Zealand. Not sure where we are with Japan, but that's one of my big goals. And then the second big goal is that once all these countries have a Magnitsky Act, is to make sure they use it, and they use it liberally, so that it's not just something that happens as a token gesture against the most heinous villain, but that it's used regularly and often, so that it does create a sense among people everywhere that if you do something terrible, there's going to be real consequences. And if that can happen, then a lot of lives all over the world will be saved. Because if people are thinking, you know what, there's going to be consequences for taking this guy out and killing him, I'm just not going to do it. If enough of that happens, then all of a sudden we've completely changed the whole chemistry of evil in the world.
Do you feel like this is moving fast enough? Do you wish you had got more jurisdictions to pass Magnitsky laws by now?
Well, to be honest, I'm amazed at how fast and how far it's gone. I mean, I'm just one individual, and with one terrible atrocity that I brought originally to the U.S. Congress, and this has just morphed and metastasized into something dramatically bigger than I could have ever imagined in my wildest expectations. And so, I mean, I'm always frustrated that there are things that I'm now trying to do that are taking longer or harder. But in terms of, I mean, I could have never imagined that this could have ever happened. And so, I certainly look at it and say to myself, I sort of scratch myself and say, this just is sort of unbelievable that Sergei Magnitsky, his sacrifice, his tragedy has led to this worldwide movement, this set of consequences. That does give me some comfort, and it makes me feel like Sergei's death wasn't a meaningless death.
I read a quote about you which made me laugh so much. It was, "He is to lobbying what Terminator is to chasing people down the road."
Right. I mean, I just don't give up, and yeah, that's true. And I mean, and a lot of people don't like me, and I guess another quality that I have is that I don't care whether people don't like me, if I think what I'm doing is right, and I know what I'm doing is right. And so, there's lots of people who find what I'm doing makes them uncomfortable. There's a lot of government officials in all countries that don't want to do sanctions because it makes their life more difficult. There's a lot of people who get money from Russia or from China who don't want to see that money, the money flow stop. There's a lot of people that just don't like somebody going in and rocking the apple cart. And so, but because I don't care what those people think, of course I care what my loved ones think, and I care what good, righteous people think. But I'm not. This is not a popularity contest. I'm not running for any office. I'm trying to get something done, and I'm ready to, hammer away and long past the level of endurance that the people who are trying to oppose me are ready to stand up and oppose me for.
So, how much of an impact do you think it's had on Putin's behavior?
So first of all, people say, look, my critics, or the critics of the Magnitsky Act, say, look, Putin is a really evil guy doing all these evil things. The Magnitsky Act is in place, and he hasn't stopped doing evil things. Therefore, the Magnitsky Act isn't effective. And I say to myself, and I say to them, well, how do you know what he would do if there wasn't a Magnitsky Act in place? And I mean, it's just simple common sense that if you have a consequence for bad actions when there was no consequence before, then the person is going to have to weigh that consequence when they decide to take a bad action. And in this particular case, we know the Magnitsky Act is effective by how angry Putin has gotten by having the Magnitsky Act in place. After the Magnitsky Act was passed, he made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He sent a personal emissary to Trump Tower to try to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He's coming after me one of his biggest targets because he's so upset with the Magnitsky Act. And so it's clear that he hates it. It puts his money at risk. We know that he tends to operate based on consequences. And so simple common sense and logic would dictate that of course is a good thing, and we should be using more of it against him when we find things that he's doing that are upsetting to us. And so, for example, with the poisoning and the arrest of Alexei Navalny made a list of 35 oligarchs that looked after Putin's money, they should be sanctioned. They haven't yet been sanctioned, and so on and so forth.
So let's talk about Navalny. I mean, what does his poisoning say to you about the state of mind at the Kremlin? I've heard a few people suggest there's a lot of paranoia at the moment.
Well, so for a long time, Alexei Navalny was able to carry on with his exposés of government corruption, Putin, and so on, and not be attacked. And the reason that he wasn't attacked was that they understood, that Putin and the people around him understood, that if they were to put him in jail or do something to him, that it would dramatically raise the temperature. It would have a lot, and Navalny is very popular. A lot of people who were following him would rise up. And then came Belarus. And Belarus was a country next to Russia, where a dictator who had been there 27 years, not Putin had been only there 20 years. And all of a sudden, the people in Belarus were rising up and dramatically challenging Lukashenko. And Putin saw this, and he said to himself, if the uprising in Belarus succeeds, that's going to send a very strong message to the people in Russia that they can rise up. And who's going to lead that uprising? It would be Alexei Navalny. And so all of a sudden, their original calculus, which was that they didn't want to provoke people, it was overcome by their fear of what was happening in Belarus. And by him surviving, it just elevated his stature dramatically, both in Russia and internationally. And then he made this unbelievably brave decision to go back to Russia. And now he's sitting there in jail, and he's of the stature of Nelson Mandela. There's no question. He might not have been before any of this happened, but he is now. And it creates a terrible problem for Putin. And so it's a real stalemate at the moment between Navalny and Putin. And both men, and it's hard to say who's going to win this stalemate.
Are we going to see more of this kind of thing? I mean, it's not been that long since the Salisbury poisonings in the UK. And then we had Navalny. Is this increasingly a strategy that Putin is going to opt for?
The Salisbury poisonings, really, there was no consequence. And the UK and various other countries expelled diplomats. It's not a very well-kept secret that after you expel diplomats, what happens is other diplomats take their place. And so it's just like swapping out people from one embassy to another. That does nothing.
Were you satisfied with the way the UK reacted?
It's a shocking lack of reaction.
So what needs to happen next time? If there is a next time?
If there is a next time, the Magnitsky Act should be used to sanction Putin's closest oligarch cronies, because they hold Putin's money. And if those people are sanctioned, Putin will really pay attention. And if that happens, there won't be a next time.
I want to talk about Trump. Do you think he got assistance in his bid for the presidency? What was your kind of view of the relationship between Trump and Putin?
Well, he definitely got assistance. I mean, it's been determined by 16 U.S. intelligence agencies that Putin interfered in the U.S. election to have him elected. And there's like documentary evidence of this. The only question is whether the assistance was organized in collusion with Donald Trump, or whether the assistance was sort of unilaterally organized by Vladimir Putin without the involvement of Donald Trump. And so I can't come to any determination. I don't have any evidence that Donald Trump had a conversation with Putin in order to ask for the assistance, but there's no question that Putin provided the assistance.
And what's your view of their relationship? Were you concerned when Trump came in?
I was terrified. Putin has wanted to get hold of me ever since this whole conflict started. And one of my biggest comforts that I've had is that I was protected by the West, that I was protected by the US and Europe. And all of a sudden, Donald Trump comes in. He prides himself on being a deal maker, and he prides himself on having a close friendship with Putin. And all of a sudden, I don't feel so safe anymore. And that really came to a head in a dramatic way in July of 2018 at the Helsinki Summit, where Trump sat down with Putin for the first time in an organized summit, and they talked about me. And the summit took place right after the 12 Russian GRU officers were indicted for interfering in the U.S. election. And when Putin was asked whether he would hand over those GRU officers, he said, "Yeah, I'll hand them over if America hands over Bill Browder." And then the journalist asked President Trump, "What do you think?" And he said, "I think that's an exceptional offer."
It's frightening for you, but do you find it like slightly satisfying that you're really getting under his skin like that?
Well, I definitely felt satisfied that I was under Putin's skin because it just shows that what I've been doing is working. I didn't feel so satisfied that Trump was involved in that because there was only downside to that part of the whole story. But interestingly, because I was never handed over, by doing that, it only raised the profile of the Magnitsky Act worldwide. And so, to a certain effect, or to a certain extent, the all of this, all the stuff that Putin has done and all the stuff that Trump has done has only increased the success of what I've been campaigning for, because everybody now all over the world knows about the Magnitsky Act.
Your book bills you as Putin's number one enemy. Would you say you're still Putin's number one enemy?
I'm no longer Putin's number one enemy. Alexei Navalny is Putin's number one enemy. I'm definitely Putin's number one foreign enemy, and I think that status remains.
And you're okay with that?
Well, it's not like it's not something you would choose to do, but when I embarked on this mission for justice, I was ready for whatever came my way, and this is what's coming my way, and I'm not going to back down, and I will continue to fight for justice, fight for Sergei Magnitsky, and fight for other victims of the Putin regime, and I'm not intimidated by their actions and by their statements and by their threats, and so I will carry on.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.